She married a human for peace, then watched him destroy armies like a deity of Queen Azira sat upon her throne, her sharp, silver eyes scanning the vast room filled with diplomats and military leaders from across the galaxy. Her reign was powerful, her enemies many, and the galaxy had known nothing but war for centuries. But even the strongest of queens had moments of doubt. The endless battles had worn on her people. The bloodshed seemed unending. She longed for peace, but it was a prize that had always felt just out of reach. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a human diplomat, Daniel, a man from a species she had always viewed as weak. The humans had never stood a chance against the might of her people, their armies small and disorganized. Azira had never taken them seriously, dismissing their ability to affect the balance of power. But Daniel came with a proposal that intrigued her. "I bring an offer of peace," Daniel had said boldly, his voice calm and measured as he stood before her. "A treaty that could end the war. All I ask for in return is a union. I ask you to marry me." The idea was absurd, yet it made a strange kind of sense. Azira had never considered marrying a human, let alone for peace. But her advisors had spoken highly of Daniel's diplomatic skills, and his human race had proven resourceful in other ways. There was something in his eyes, a fire, that told her he was not like other humans she had encountered. She studied him closely, unsure whether to laugh or take him seriously. His offer was bold, but what could a human bring to a galaxy like hers? Still, she had always prided herself on making decisions that would ensure her people's survival, and this could be her chance to finally end the war. "I will marry you," she said, her voice as cold and regal as ever. "But understand this, it is a marriage of convenience. It is not a gesture of love, it is simply a tool to secure peace. Do not expect anything more." Daniel bowed, though his eyes never left hers. "Understood, Your Majesty, peace is all that matters." The treaty was signed within the week, and the marriage was arranged. Azira remained distant, viewing this union as nothing more than a strategic move. There would be no emotion, no connection. Her people needed peace, and this was the price they would pay. The day of the wedding arrived, and Azira stood before a crowd of her subjects. She wore the ceremonial robes of her people, a shimmering silver gown that reflected the harsh light of the galaxy's twin suns. The crowd cheered as Daniel entered the hall. He was dressed in a simple, human suit, nothing fancy, but there was something about him that made him stand out. His confidence, his calmness in the face of such a momentous event, drew Azira's attention. She watched as he walked toward her, his eyes focused on her. It was strange to think of him as her husband, a mere human who would help her end the war. But there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that made Azira pause. The vows were simple. There was no grand declaration of love or promises of a future together. Azira simply pledged her commitment to the peace that this union would bring. Daniel, too, pledged to do his part, but it was clear to all that their marriage was more about securing a future for their people than any personal bond. When the ceremony was over, they stood side by side, their hands briefly touching as they faced the crowd. The cheers echoed in the hall, but Azira felt nothing. She had done what was necessary, but the weight of the decision still hung heavy on her shoulders. For the following days, life in the palace resumed its usual pace. Azira kept herself busy with the affairs of the kingdom, while Daniel attended to the details of the peace treaty. There was little interaction between the two, save for the formalities. They would sit together at dinners, exchanging pleasantries, but there was no connection. Azira could not bring herself to feel anything for him beyond what was required by the treaty. But then came the attack. A group of rebel leaders, loyal to the factions that had opposed the peace talks, launched a surprise assault on the palace. Their forces were well equipped, but Azira's military was still far superior. The battle was expected to be short and decisive. But when the rebels breached the gates, something unexpected happened. Daniel, though not a soldier, took charge of the situation. He stood in front of Azira, calmly issuing orders to the guards and soldiers. His words were clear, his voice steady. The rebels had underestimated him, just as Azira had. In a matter of hours, Daniel had rallied the troops, organizing them into defensive positions, countering the rebel tactics with a precision that shocked Azira. When the fighting finally ceased, the palace was secure. The rebels had been defeated and many of their leaders were captured. Azira surveyed the damage, her mind reeling. "How did you do that?" she asked Daniel, her voice low. Daniel stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "It's about thinking differently. They expected us to fight like they would, but I knew if we adjusted our tactics, used their own assumptions against them, we could win." Azira stared at him, her mind racing. She had expected Daniel to be a figurehead, a simple pawn in the game of peace. But instead, he had proven himself to be a force in his own right. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to demonstrate his remarkable ability to think outside the box. The human strategist had a keen mind, and his approach to leadership was unlike anything Azira had ever witnessed. He didn't rely on brute force or the superior technology of her people. He relied on intelligence, on understanding his enemies in ways they didn't understand themselves. Azira had always prided herself on her strategic mind, but she found herself learning from Daniel. She began to see him not just as a diplomat or a husband, but as someone who could change the very course of the war. She found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his ability to lead without the need for dominance. But even then, Azira kept her distance. The peace was the priority, not her growing respect for Daniel. She could not afford to let herself get too close. There was too much at stake, yet in the back of her mind, Azira knew something had changed. She had married a human for peace, but now she was starting to see him in a new light. The days of the warlord queen were behind her. Now she was beginning to wonder if Daniel might just be the key to more than just peace. As the weeks passed, Azira found herself watching him more closely. There was something about his quiet confidence, his unwavering commitment to his people, that made her question everything she had believed about humans. He was not just a tool for peace. He was a force to be reckoned with in his own right. The days following the battle were filled with a strange silence in the palace. Queen Azira had spent her entire life at the center of chaos, surrounded by war and bloodshed. Yet now, for the first time in many years, the palace was calm. The rebellion had been crushed, but Azira could not shake the feeling that something had changed. The humans she had once viewed as insignificant had proven themselves in a way she hadn't expected. Daniel had become a quiet hero. In the aftermath of the attack, he had remained composed and focused, offering strategies for peace and helping with the rebuilding efforts. His calm leadership during the chaos had earned him the respect of those who had once dismissed him as nothing more than a symbol of the peace treaty. Yet Azira could not help but notice something deeper in his actions, his ability to think clearly, even in the most dire situations. It was not just his tactics that impressed her, but his capacity to understand people, to see their fears and desires. She had always ruled with force, knowing that her power was unmatched. But Daniel led with something different, a strength that came not from power, but from his understanding of others. He did not command people with authority. He inspired them with his words, with his vision of a peaceful future. Azira had never seen anything like it. She had initially thought that this marriage, this union, would be a mere political tool. A treaty signed with a human to end the war. But now, it felt as if she had unintentionally invited something far greater into her life. One morning, Azira stood on the balcony of her chamber, staring out at the vast landscape of her homeworld. The twin suns hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. For the first time in a long while, she found herself contemplating the future. The war had been long, the cost had been high, and peace seemed like a distant dream. But now she wasn't so sure. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Daniel, as usual, coming to discuss the next phase of the peace talks. But today, his presence felt different. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that had not been there before. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty?" Daniel asked, standing in the doorway, his posture straight but not stiff. He looked as calm as ever, but Azira could sense something stirring beneath the surface. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. "Come in." As he entered the room, Azira found herself observing him more closely. There was something about his presence that was more commanding now. It was not a change of demeanor, but something deeper, something that she couldn't put her finger on. She had never expected to find herself so intrigued by a human. "How are the preparations for the next phase of the peace talks?" Azira asked, trying to maintain a professional distance. She had always been focused on the greater goal, the peace she so desperately needed for her people. "Everything is proceeding as planned," Daniel said, his voice calm, his tone even. "We're preparing for the formal agreement to be signed in the coming weeks." I've made sure that all parties are on board. It's going to be difficult, but I believe we can secure lasting peace." Azira nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She had to admit she found herself impressed by how well Daniel had handled everything. The rebellion had not only failed to disrupt the peace process, but had instead united the people even more. They had witnessed the strength of the human diplomat, and now they respected him. He had become something of a symbol of hope and resilience. But still, Azira struggled to reconcile her feelings. She had never been one to trust others easily. Her reign had been built on power, on control. And yet, here was this human who had won her respect without lifting a finger in battle. She could not ignore the way he made her feel, both challenged and inspired. "I've been thinking," Azira began, her voice low, "about the way you handled the rebellion. You didn't fight them with weapons, but with strategy and words. It's something I've never seen before." She paused, feeling the weight of her words. Perhaps I underestimated you." Daniel's expression softened, but he said nothing for a moment. Azira wondered if she had crossed some line, but she couldn't take back what she had said. It was the truth, and she found herself wondering why she had never seen it before. "I don't believe you underestimated me," Daniel finally replied, his voice thoughtful. "You simply didn't know what humans are capable of. We've always fought with our minds as much as with our strength. It's how we've survived, and it's how we've come to lead in places where others have failed." Azira nodded, her mind whirling. She had always believed that strength meant power, that to rule was to dominate. But Daniel was proving to her that strength could take many forms. She had seen it in the way he had led the human forces to victory, not with sheer force, but with ingenuity, with understanding. For the next few days, Azira found herself watching Daniel more closely. She observed how he interacted with the soldiers, how he listened to them, offering words of encouragement. She saw how his presence seemed to calm them, how they looked to him not just as a leader, but as someone they could trust. It was an odd thing for Azira to witness. She had never seen anyone command such loyalty without demanding it through fear. It wasn't long before word spread of Daniel's victory. Stories of the human diplomat's bravery and intellect began to circulate throughout the galaxy. Azira's enemies, once certain that the peace would collapse, now found themselves facing a human who could not be ignored. The tides were shifting, and Azira realized that Daniel was not just an asset to the peace process. He was a force in his own right. Azira found herself torn. The peace was still her priority, but the more she saw of Daniel, the more she realized that her feelings were becoming something more than professional admiration. There was something about him that she couldn't deny, a quality that was unlike anything she had ever seen in any other being, human or otherwise. As the days passed, Azira felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. She had once ruled with an iron fist, but now she was beginning to see that power did not always lie in control. It lay in the ability to inspire, to bring people together. And Daniel was a master at that, but she was still wary. She could not allow herself to grow too close to him. The stakes were too high. The future of her people rested on the peace treaty, and she could not afford to let personal feelings cloud her judgment. Yet, as she stood once again on the balcony overlooking her world, she couldn't help but wonder, could peace be more than just a political victory? Could it be the beginning of something greater, something that neither she nor Daniel had ever anticipated? Azira stood in the war room, her eyes fixed on the holographic map of the galaxy. The rebellion had not ended with the last battle. It had only shifted, like a storm that momentarily passed but left the air thick with tension. Now her people faced new challenges, ones that tested not only her military strength, but also the fragile peace she had fought so hard to secure. The treaty was still in place, but the galaxy had not yet settled into the quiet Azira had hoped for. Daniel entered the room quietly, his usual calm demeanor unmistakable. Azira felt an odd sense of calm in his presence, something she hadn't expected when they first married. He had been a diplomat at first, a man of words and treaties. But now, with every challenge they faced, he had become something more, a force in his own right. His ideas and strategies had brought victories, and the respect he had gained from both her people and theirs was unlike anything Azira had seen. "Your Majesty," Daniel began, his voice steady, "we need to take a different approach to the insurgents on the Outer Rim. Conventional tactics will not work. We must think beyond what they expect." Azira turned to face him, her brow furrowing slightly. And what do you suggest? Daniel's eyes met hers with quiet confidence. The enemy expects us to fight in the way they would, brutally head-on with overwhelming force. But we can use their assumptions against them. We need to be unpredictable. Azira studied him for a moment, considering his words. She had always prided herself on her strategic mind, but there was something about the way Daniel spoke that made her pause. He wasn't just offering tactics, he was offering a shift in thinking. It was subtle, but it was powerful. For the next few days, Azira watched as Daniel began to implement his plans. They weren't like anything she had seen before. There were no large-scale battles, no massive confrontations. Instead, Daniel focused on sabotage, misinformation, and deception. He had the enemy chasing shadows, disrupting their supply lines, and turning their own forces against them. It was brilliant, but it was also a different kind of warfare, one that required patience and precision. Daniel's methods started to have a noticeable effect. The insurgents grew frustrated, their morale began to crumble, and their attacks became less frequent. But what truly struck Azira was how effortlessly Daniel made it all seem. He was a master of psychological warfare, manipulating the enemy's emotions and expectations. They never saw him coming. He was like a shadow in the night, moving with precision and purpose, always one step ahead. Azira found herself captivated by his brilliance. She had known that humans were resourceful, but she had never imagined they could be so effective in war. She had underestimated them in ways she hadn't realized until now. Daniel had turned the tide without ever lifting a weapon, and in doing so, he had earned the admiration of her people. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the palace, Azira could no longer hold back the questions that had been building in her mind. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice low. "How do you stay so calm, even when everything around you is in chaos?" Daniel looked at her, his expression softening. "I think it's because I've learned not to fear the chaos. It's just a part of life, but what really matters is what you do in the midst of it. You can either be swallowed by it or you can shape it to your will." Azira was struck by his words. She had always been someone who fought to control everything around her, to bend the universe to her will. But Daniel's approach was different. He didn't try to control the chaos. He worked with it, understood it, and used it to his advantage. For the first time, Azira felt something she had never felt before, a sense of peace. It was not the kind of peace she had expected, not the calm that came from victory in battle or from controlling every aspect of her world. It was a different kind of peace, one that came from trusting in the process, in the journey, and in the people around her. As the weeks passed, Daniel's influence on the war effort continued to grow. His tactics had begun to reshape the way Azira's people viewed warfare. He had shown them that there was more to victory than strength and power. There was a way to fight without fighting at all. His strategy was like a dance, one that required grace, patience, and a deep understanding of the enemy's mind. It was something Azira had never considered before. And then came the day when Azira's people truly saw Daniel for what he had become. It was a day that would change the course of the war and solidify his place as one of the greatest leaders in the galaxy. Azira had received word that an enemy fleet was approaching, much larger than any they had faced before. It was a threat unlike anything they had seen in years, and the conventional approach would have been to meet them in battle, to face them head-on and overwhelm them with force. But Daniel had other plans. "We can't afford to fight them in a battle," Daniel said as they gathered in the war room. "The fleet is too large and we don't have the resources to engage them directly, but we do have one advantage." Azira raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What advantage?" Daniel's lips curled into a slight smile. "We know how they think, and we know where they're weakest." For the next several days, Daniel put his plan into motion. He instructed Azira's forces to create false signals, leading the enemy fleet toward a dead zone in space, a place where no ships could navigate, where the sensors would fail, and where the enemy's advanced technology would be useless. It was a trap, one that no one expected. As the enemy fleet entered the dead zone, they found themselves cut off from communication, disoriented and vulnerable. Azira's forces moved swiftly, attacking from all sides. The enemy fleet, once so powerful and confident, was shattered in a matter of hours. It was a complete victory, and it was all thanks to Daniel's strategy. The galaxy had been watching, and now they were witnessing something extraordinary. A human, once dismissed as weak, had become the key to victory. His ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies had earned him the respect of not only Azira's people, but also her allies and enemies alike. As the final enemy ships were destroyed, Azira stood on the bridge, watching the results unfold. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel pride, not in her own actions, but in Daniel's. He had done what no one else had thought possible. He had turned the tide of the war without ever firing a shot. "Well done," Azira said, her voice full of admiration. Daniel turned to her, his expression calm as always. "We did it together," he replied, but Azira knew the truth. He had done this. He had won this victory with nothing more than his mind and his will. For Azira, the war was no longer just about peace. It was about understanding, about breaking the old ways of thinking and seeing the world in a new light. And in that moment, she realized that peace was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of something far greater. The days following the victory over the enemy fleet were filled with a sense of accomplishment. But for Azira, there was an unsettling stillness that hung in the air. Her people had never been so unified, and the rebellion was all but crushed. Yet, as much as she wanted to celebrate, there was a growing sense of unease deep within her. The galaxy had changed, and so had she. Daniel, the human she had married for peace, had proven time and again that he was more than just a diplomat. He was a force of nature, a leader who commanded respect and admiration. As Azira walked through the palace halls, she could feel the eyes of her people on her. Whispers followed her wherever she went. They no longer saw her as just the queen. They saw her as the queen who had brought peace with a human, the queen who had allowed a human to lead their forces to victory. Azira had never cared for the opinions of others, but now she found herself wondering about the kind of legacy she was leaving behind. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the sudden attention. He continued to work tirelessly, guiding the peace process, helping to rebuild the shattered systems, and ensuring that the new government would be strong and stable. He didn't seek the spotlight, yet it seemed to find him anyway. People spoke of him with reverence, and even Azira's most trusted advisors began to look to him for advice. She had never seen anything like it. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Azira found herself in her private chambers, staring out at the darkened sky. The stars above seemed distant, like forgotten memories, and she felt a pang of loneliness. She had always been in control, always been the one people looked to for guidance, but now she found herself unsure of where her place was. She had married Daniel for peace, but now she realized that he had become something far more important than that. He was not just her husband, he was her equal. A knock on the door broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway. His face was calm as always, but there was something different in his eyes, a softness that she had come to recognize. "May I come in?" he asked gently. Azira nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Azira could feel the weight of the silence between them, a silence that had grown since the war had ended. She had never been one to express her emotions, but she felt the need to say something now. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability, "about everything that's happened, about the war, the treaty, and us." Daniel looked at her with quiet understanding, as if he had been waiting for her to speak. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. Azira took a deep breath, her mind swirling with thoughts she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. "I've never had anyone to challenge me like you do. You've made me question things I've never thought to question. You've made me see a different way of leading, a different way of living." Daniel's eyes softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I didn't mean to challenge you," he said, his voice gentle. "I only wanted to help, to offer a different perspective. You've always been strong, Azira, but sometimes strength comes from listening, from understanding." Azira felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so long believing that power came from control, from fear, from domination. But Daniel had shown her that there was a different kind of strength. It was the strength of conviction, of leadership that came from the heart. It was a kind of power that didn't rely on fear, but on trust. "I don't know if I've been a good queen," Azira confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've led with power, with fear, but now I wonder if there's more to it than that." Daniel reached out and gently placed his hand on hers. "You've been a good queen," he said softly. You've done what you thought was right and you've brought peace to your people, but there's always room to grow, always room to learn. We both have a lot to learn from each other." Azira looked at him, her heart racing. She had never allowed herself to feel so vulnerable to admit her doubts and fears. But with Daniel, it was different. She felt as though she could be herself without the weight of expectations or the pressure of leadership bearing down on her. "I don't want to lose myself in all of this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to become someone I'm not. I've spent so long building this empire, and now I feel like I don't know who I am anymore." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone in this, Azira. You don't have to do everything by yourself. We're in this together." Azira closed her eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. She had always been the queen, the ruler, the one who was expected to have all the answers. But in Daniel, she found someone who didn't expect her to have all the answers. He was willing to stand beside her, to help her figure it out together. As they stood there, the weight of the galaxy seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Azira had spent so long fighting, so long striving for peace, but now she realized that peace was not just the absence of war. It was the ability to be vulnerable, to trust, and to build something lasting with others. Over the next few weeks, Azira and Daniel worked even closer together. The peace process continued to unfold, and with each passing day, Azira found herself growing more confident in her new approach to leadership. She had once believed that power came from control, but now she saw that true power came from the ability to empower others, to inspire them to believe in something greater than themselves. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Azira stood before her window once again, looking out at the stars. She was no longer the queen who ruled with fear. She was the queen who ruled with purpose, with a vision for a better future, and with the strength to listen and learn. Daniel entered the room quietly, as he often did, and stood beside her. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. Together they gazed out at the stars, the future of the galaxy no longer uncertain, but full of promise. Azira had once believed that she could do everything on her own, that she could control every aspect of her life and her reign. But now she realized that true strength lay in sharing that burden, in trusting others, and in building a future that was not just hers but theirs together. "Thank you," Azira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" Daniel asked, his gaze still fixed on the stars. "For being here," Azira replied, turning to face him. "For helping me see what true strength really is." Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with understanding. "We're in this together, Azira, always." And for the first time in her life, Azira believed it. The galaxy had changed, and so had Azira. What had once been a vast empire, ruled by a queen whose every decision was dictated by power and control, had become a realm that was slowly learning the true meaning of peace. She had spent so many years fighting, so many years building walls around her heart, believing that strength was measured in force. But now, with Daniel by her side, she saw the world through a different lens. Peace was not just the absence of war. It was the ability to build, to trust, and to lead with compassion. As the months passed, the treaty held. The galaxy was calm, at least for now, and the people were beginning to feel the shift. Trade routes were reopened, colonies flourished, and the bitterness that had plagued the galaxy for so long began to fade. But there were still those who were skeptical, those who doubted the fragile peace. They were the ones who had profited from the chaos, the ones who thrived in the darkness of war, and they were not easily convinced. Azira sat in the council chamber, surrounded by her most trusted advisors, but her mind wasn't fully on the discussion. The faces of the counselors blurred together as she thought about the future. The treaty had been signed, and most of the galaxy had agreed to it, but there were still pockets of resistance. Rebel factions, criminal syndicates, and those who had once sought to exploit the war were still a threat. It was a matter of time before they would make their move. Daniel entered the room quietly, as he always did. He had become more than just her husband. He was now her closest advisor, her partner in everything. He had helped her see that peace wasn't something that could be imposed by force. It was something that had to be nurtured, something that had to grow over time. And Daniel's patience, his ability to see the bigger picture, had become invaluable. Azira glanced at him as he took his place beside her. He had been right about so much: the war, the treaty, and even the way she had approached leadership. He had shown her a new way, one that she would never have considered before. It was not the way of power. It was the way of understanding, of using intellect and compassion to guide people to a better future. Your Majesty, one of the counselors began, pulling her back to the present, we've received reports of increased activity from the rebel factions along the outer rim. They are still organizing, gathering forces. We believe they are preparing for another assault. Azira's eyes narrowed. How many? She asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. At least a dozen ships with more expected, the counselor replied. It is not yet clear how serious their intentions are, but we believe they are testing our defenses. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm and sure. We know they will strike soon, he said, but we can't fight them the same way we fought before. We need to outthink them just as we did with the rebellion. Azira looked at him, her thoughts aligning with his. He was right. The old methods of fighting would not work. They had learned that much. It wasn't about overwhelming the enemy with force. It was about using their own tactics against them, about staying one step ahead. We'll use the same strategy we did before, Azira said, her eyes locking with Daniel S. We'll create false signals, lead them into a trap, but this time we need to be quicker, more decisive. Daniel nodded. We can use their expectations against them again. They'll think they know what we're going to do, and that's exactly when we'll strike. The room fell silent as the counselors exchanged looks. They were hesitant, unsure of the plan, but they had come to trust Daniel's methods. He had proven them right time and again. And Azira, who had once doubted him, now found herself fully relying on his instincts. I agree, Azira said, her voice unwavering. We'll execute this plan at once. Prepare the fleet, but do not engage until we are sure they are within range. We'll wait until the right moment. As the counselors began to leave the room, Azira remained seated, her mind still racing. This was it, the final test of the peace they had worked so hard to achieve. If they failed, the consequences would be dire. But she had faith. Faith in Daniel and her people, and in the strength they had built together. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The fleet was readied, and the false signals were set in motion. Daniel and Azira worked together, watching the enemy's movements closely, analyzing every detail. They were prepared for whatever came next. When the time finally arrived, it came with terrifying speed. The enemy fleet, more than a dozen ships strong, arrived on the outer rim just as Daniel had predicted. They moved with precision just as the rebels had before, but this time, they were walking right into a trap. Now, Azira said quietly, her eyes fixed on the monitor as she gave the command. Engage them. The fleet moved into position, cutting off the enemy's escape routes. The battle was swift, decisive, and over before it even began. The rebels, caught off guard and disoriented, were quickly overwhelmed. Their ships were disabled, and their leaders taken into custody. It was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how fragile peace truly was. As the dust settled, Azira found herself standing beside Daniel once again, watching the results unfold. They had won, but the war was far from over. There would always be those who sought to tear down what they had built, but Azira had learned something important. Peace wasn't something you could simply win. It was something you had to protect, something you had to fight for every day. Daniel turned to her, his expression calm but filled with pride. We did it, he said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. Azira smiled, feeling the weight of everything they had accomplished. We did, she said, her voice full of determination. But this is only the beginning. In the months that followed, the galaxy slowly began to heal. The treaty held, and the resistance faded into obscurity. The rebels who had once threatened to undo everything they had worked for were either neutralized or brought into the fold, their power broken. But for Azira and Daniel, the battle was never truly over. They knew that true peace required constant effort, constant vigilance. But they also knew that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had built something stronger than an empire. They had built a future, one that was defined not by fear and power, but by trust and understanding. As Azira looked out over the stars once again, she realized that the galaxy she had inherited had changed. And so had she. No longer the queen who ruled with fear, she had become a leader who ruled with compassion, who led not by force, but by example. And beside her stood Daniel, the human who had taught her the true meaning of strength. Together, they had brought peace to the galaxy. And together, they would continue to protect it, no matter the cost.